The Iceberg Hermit, Chapter 5. First thing the next morning, Alan made a wooden canvas covered frame to fit the cabin window and keep out the frozen wind. Because the ship was so tightly surrounded by ice, he was afraid that the air inside the cabin might go bad. So every morning he rolled his canvas shade part way up. This let a certain amount of fresh air come in, and also let in some light. For several days he kept putting up and taking down the cast iron grate every time he left the cabin. But when he no longer saw any sign of bears in the area, he got tired of constantly handling the heavy grate and one day left it down. The next thing Alan did was to get the door of the cabin open. It took him a while, for the door opened outward and was jammed by a solid wall of ice on the outside. But finally he got the door off its hinge posts and taken down. For a moment he stared at the solid ice that blocked his way. Ordinarily, there was an open deck to cross between the captain's cabin and the forecastle, where the crew slept. But this open area was now packed solid with ice, and Alan would have to hack out a tunnel before he could reach the crew's quarters. To make it even worse, the work would have to be done in semi-darkness and in bitter cold. It took him all that day and half of the next day to reach the forecastle, but when he got inside the crew's quarters, he was well rewarded. He found some flints to make fire with, his tobacco and pipe, plenty of clothes, pieces of sailcloth, and other useful objects. Most important of all, he found the floor covered with pieces of coal that had spilled out of the coal bin when the ship turned turtle. Underneath everything was an old hatchet that had been used to break up the larger lumps of coal. He moved all his new possessions to the captain's cabin and spent most of the next day moving all the coal. He could not be sure when the ice overhead might sink down and block up his tunnel. Alan lost no time in lighting a fire. Not wanting to burn a hole in anything, he placed the coals and kindling in the empty biscuit tin. For a while he just sat there, hunched over the fire, enjoying the red glow, the warmth, the tiny flames that licked out between the pieces of coal. He got his hands down close to the heat. Then he took off his boots and stockings and got his feet nice and warm. Next he melted some ice in a billy can, boiled the water, and enjoyed the luxury of his first face and neck wash in over a week. But with that first fire, Alan ran across a new problem. The cabin filled up with smoke, and to keep from choking he had to crouch on the floor. He badly needed some way to get rid of the smoke. He tried moving his makeshift stove over to the cabin window, but the draft of air coming down the outside tunnel blew the smoke back into his face. Alan put out the fire and decided he would have to cut a hole in the ceiling. With the ship upside down, the after hold was above him, and he could let the smoke drift up and into the hold. Of course, what was now the ceiling used to be the floor, and Alan had to cut through a layer of heavy carpet and 2 wooden floor layers before he broke through and into the hold. And here he ran across another problem. Immediately above him were several hundred barrels of whale blubber from the last whale the Anne Forbes had captured. Alan set to work with the tools at hand, the harpoon head, the old hatchet, and his carving knife, because everything was frozen, including the 2-foot squares of whale meat in the barrel. It was like trying to make a hole in cement. In fact, sparks sometimes flew when he attacked the frozen wood. After hours of work, he managed to break the barrel apart and drag down the frozen chunks of meat. The wood from the barrel he set aside as fuel. He next made a torch from old rags soaked in a lamp oil and stuffed into the bottom half of a broken bottle. Lighting his rough torch, he stepped up on a chair and thrust the lamp into the hole. He groaned. The way was blocked by another barrel lying on its side. He had to do the same job all over again, only this time standing on a chair and with hardly any room to use his tools. He climbed down from the chair and kicked the harpoon head and hatchet out of the way. It was useless. He might as well give up. Every muscle ached, and more than anything else he wanted to climb into his closet. pull the covers over his head, and forget that he was still on the amphorbes. But he sat down on the chair and forced himself to examine his problem. He had often been in that hold, had helped roll in the barrels of whale meat from the last carcass, and he knew that the barrels were stacked 3 high, which meant that he had to cut through 2 more layers before he could break clear and into the empty space in the hold. No, 1 more, because the last barrel could be pushed aside. Then there would be 2 or 3 feet of open space between the barrels and the bottom of the hull. Once he was in that clear space, he could crawl over the barrels and break his way into all the other holds of the ship, protected from the elements above by a strong oaken keel. Wearily he got to his feet, stood up on the chair and began to try and break apart the next barrel. Hours later he had the second barrel broken up and the frozen blubber pulled down and piled up against the walls of the cabin. As he feared, there was yet another barrel blocking the hole, but this one had nothing on top of it, and he was finally able to roll it out of the way. Then he crawled up through the hold and into the clear area above the barrels. In the light of the torch, he could look up at the floor planks laid over the bottom of the ribbed frame. He still had to break through several layers of tough planks to make a hole to the outside. He climbed back down the hole and dropped into the cabin. He would start to break through the keel tomorrow. At least he now had a way of getting into the other holds of the amphorbes and did not have to worry that the ice might close in and block his way to the forecastle. With some wood shavings and lamp oil, he managed to get a small coal fire going. While some of the smoke went up through and into the hold above him, most of it gradually filled the cabin until a heavy pile of smoke lay just under the ceiling. Before the smoke got too heavy, he had time to hack off a few pieces of whale meat, stick them on the point of his carving knife, and thaw them out over the fire. After nothing but biscuits for the past weeks, the half-raw whale meat tasted delicious and he ate his fill. He stored the rest of the whale meat in the ice tunnel outside the cabin door, read a page of the Bible, and then put out the fire with melted ice water. Then he settled into bed inside the clothes closet, taking with him his flint, a rough torch of oil-soaked rags, and his carving knife, just in case another bear decided to pay him a visit. The next day Alan went outside, climbed up to the end of the keel, and began to hack a hole in the ship's planking. He swung the hatchet and it bounced off the frozen wood. He swung again, and this time managed to cut a few fibres of the tough frozen oak. Furiously, he pounded on the keel. The oak was so frozen that he was mashing the wood instead of cutting it. Another blow and the hatchet skidded off the planking and flew out of his hands. Cursing, he scrambled down from the keel to retrieve his axe. By the time he found it, his hands were numb and useless from the cold. He went back inside the cabin, took off his mittens and warmed his hands over the small coal fire. All he had to work with was the harpoon head, the coal hatchet, the whaleboat anchor, and his carving knife. He could not work more than 10 or 15 minutes without going inside to thaw out his frozen hands, and there was now only a couple of hours of daylight every day. The slow and tortuous work took 3 days, but finally he had a fair-sized hole clear through the ship's bottom and into the hold. To his delight, he found that his rough chimney now worked beautifully. The smoke was pulled out of the cabin and up into the hold, where it soon made its way through the keel and into the sky. For the first time in days, the air in the cabin was clear. The new chimney arrangement made Alan happy for another reason. The smoke rising from the keel might now be noticed by a ship that would otherwise pass the iceberg without spotting him. Remembering all that whale meat in the hold above him, he began to hope that he could make it through the winter on the amphorbes. In Thanksgiving, he read several pages of the Bible, drank half a cup of rum to celebrate, then retired to his closet for a good night's sleep. For the first time since the ship went down, Alan felt comfortably warm, well fed, and somewhat hopeful for the future. The big thing that worried him now was the loneliness. With no one to talk to share his problems with, even to argue with, it was hard to keep his spirits up. After a while, nothing seemed important anymore if there was no one else around to see how important it was. One thing he had noticed, the time went by a lot faster when he was working hard. During the past 3 or 4 days he hadn't once been bothered by the feeling that time was standing still. He would have to line up a whole lot of jobs to do so that he kept himself constantly busy. He would have to make a calendar to keep track of the days. Already he was no longer sure if the Ann Forbes struck the iceberg 1 week or 2 weeks ago. Tomorrow he would see about making his cabin, especially the closet, as windproof and coldproof as possible. It was the beginning of October, and he had 6 rough months ahead of him. He would have to be well prepared to last out the freezing cold and week-long blizzards that were sure to come. And thinking hopefully for the future, Alan fell asleep. Some time later he was awakened by sounds outside the closet. He thought he heard heavy breathing and the sound of something being moved. Or was he just dreaming? He sat up, held his breath, and listened. There was no mistaking that heavy snuffling sound. Another polar bear had entered the cabin. Alan felt the heavy hand of fear clutch his heart. Maybe if he stayed where he was and stayed quiet, the bear would go away. Another crash, and this time he realized that the bear had found one of his tins of biscuits and was trying to open it. He did not want to leave the closet and try to chase the bear, but neither did he want all his biscuits eaten or ruined. And if he stayed where he was, the animal might decide to break into the closet and then he would be trapped. As quietly as possible, Alan managed to get his torch lit. With the carving knife in one hand and the torch in the other, he kicked open the door and jumped out with a wild yell. The startled bear stood up on his hind legs, looked at Alan and grunted. Alan stood stock still in his fear. The bear seemed to be 10 feet tall, though he later realized that the animal had to be under 6 feet, since that was the distance between the floor and the ceiling of the cabin. For a long moment, Bear and Alan looked at each other. A drop of burning oil fell on Alan's hand and he let out a sudden cry. The bear dropped to all fours, whirled around and made for the entrance hole. The animal smashed into the window frame and somehow got tangled up in the canvas flap that covered the hole. The bear's head, one shoulder and one arm were through the frame, but the rest of the body remained in the cabin. For a moment the bear was jammed. Alan thought of several things at once. The bear might decide to pull back from the hole and turn on him. If he managed to kill the bear, he would have fresh meat. He was so frightened that he had to do something. He hurriedly set the torch in the tin box that he used as a stove, ran over and plunged his knife into the bear's side, just beneath the huge white arm. Then, holding onto the bear's back, he sank the knife again and again into the animal's body, into the neck, the side, and the stomach. The bear roared with pain and threw Alan off in its struggles. Alan fell on the stove and the torch went out. For a long moment he lay on the floor of the cabin, out of breath, and wondered what he should do. He almost went back inside his closet, but he realized that, no matter how frightened he was, he could not leave the animal until he was sure that it was fatally wounded. He tried to relight the torch, but could not find his flint. Afraid then that the bear might yet work loose and destroy everything in the cabin, including himself, Alan went over to the dim white shape and plunged the knife again and again into the animal's body. Once more Alan was thrown off, and once more he returned to the attack, sensing that the animal was growing weaker. In a curious way, it was easier to fight the bear in the dark. Alan did not have to look at those curving points of black claws on the ends of the animal's powerful paws. He could not see those fearful teeth, those black lips and terrible snarl. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the animal stopped its struggles and Alan lay back on the floor, completely done in. It took a good 15 minutes to recover from his fear. Then he had to pad around in the dark of his closet to find the flint and get the torch relit. As soon as the flame flared brightly in the cabin, he was astonished at the sight that met his eyes. The polar bear had turned completely red. Blood seemed to be on everything. Even his own clothes were soaked with it, and as he watched, a thin trickle of blood ran from the animal's mouth and dripped into a pool on the floor. It was funny, but he hadn't felt the blood when he was attacking the bear. All he had noticed was the animal's fearsome strength and the heavy rank smell that came from its body. Alan felt wildly happy and desperately sick at the same time. In fact, for a moment, he thought he was going to pass out, so he drew a half cup of rum and sat down to drink it. After he had gained some control over his nerves, he went over to look at the bear. The animal's black tongue hanging out of its mouth had already started to freeze. Alan was still too excited to go back to bed, so he began to clean and skin the bear. He cut the body into square pieces that he stored along with the whale blubber in the ice tunnel just outside the door. There the meat would freeze and be available any time he wanted it. It took him several hours to finish the job. He skinned out the fur and spread it on hooks on the wall of the cabin. When it was dry and all of the blood washed out of it, it would make a good robe for his bed. He figured that he had at least 200 pounds of fresh meat now stored away, and he knew that fresh meat was important. Although he guessed there was plenty of salted meat somewhere on the Forbes, a diet of salt meat and ship biscuits without any fruit or vegetables usually led to scurvy, and scurvy was a disease that often proved fatal. When everything was cleaned up and put away, Alan went to his entrance hole, climbed through the snow tunnel and went outside. Daybreak had come, and it was going to be a beautiful sunny day. Even though it would still be cold, he climbed up on top of the keel and looked around. The Forbes was now so well locked into the ice that Alan could not spot the open sea anywhere. They were frozen fast for at least the next 6 months. The cold soon drove Alan back inside. This time he put on the iron grate, as well as the canvas covering, and while the grate might not keep out a really determined bear, it might slow him up enough to let Alan find some other way to stop the animal from entering. Alan realised that his open snow tunnel looked like a possible cave opening to bears, which might be why they were attracted to the cabin window. Or it might be the smell of whale blubber being carried on the smoke that rose up through the hold and out the opening in the keel. And that smell would probably carry for miles, which meant that he could expect more visits from wandering and hungry bears. Alan opened the closet door and settled under the covers, trying to make up for lost sleep. But his body had still not unwound from the fight with the bear, so he lay awake there in the darkness for another hour before finally drifting off. And in his sleep he dreamed that someone was calling his name from a great distance, someone who kept crying and crying and would not stop. It's the end of chapter 5. Good night, sleep tight.